Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
Pretty quiet week, really, as it relates to markets and reports, but it's been really not a great week as we talk about trade and commodity activities. Why don't you recap what happened this week in the markets?
Yeah, absolutely. If we start this week on the cattle side, cash-fed cattle this week were down about $1.25. Those cash feeder cattle markets were fairly steady this week when we look at those. Yet when you look at the future side of the equation, it got tough this week in cattle markets. The December live cattle futures contract closed down $2.75, while the January feeder cattle futures contract was down nearly $6 this week. On the beef side, that choice box beef price was up 86 cents this week. We had strength nearly across the board in all the components of that choice box beef price. Ribs and short plate were up pretty hard this week. On the pork side of the equation, Barrow and gilt prices down $1.64 this week relative to last Friday. The December lean hog futures contract was down $2.65. Again, futures contracts on the livestock side were off hard across the board. I wonder if some of the African swine fever news or lack thereof this week might have driven us a little bit lower. On the pork cutout value, we were down $3.60 this week on the pork cutout value. That was with weakness across the board in all components, but loins and bellies really led that weakness on the pork side.
Scott, as we talk about that, there really hasn't been as much news on the African swine fever front, but we still know that it's an uncertainty about how much and how big that impact could be. As we look at that, is it something that producers need to keep in mind as they're looking at prices and the futures contracts and seeing where those are going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some opportunities, again, on the risk management side, although markets are down this week. I think when we have weeks where the concern about African swine fever grows, that gives futures contracts some lift out there that we want to be paying attention to. Weeks where there's less news there, I certainly think you find futures contracts struggling relative to cash in particular, with them being a lot higher right now. So moving back towards cash in those weeks where there's not a lot of new news in terms of ASF. I wish I knew at the end of the day what we were going to get, and I keep repeating the same thing of it's either going to be really bad or it's not. And if it's not, we're going to have a lot of supplies of pork in the marketplace again in 2019 to deal with. If African swine fever turns out to be a very big issue, we may not get a lot of direct exports to China as a result of that, but I sure think we pick up some markets that the European Union likely leaves behind as they increase their trade into China.
Scott, it's a pretty quiet week as it relates to reports. Let's start first, though. WASDE came out. Not a lot of changes as it relates to the livestock side of things.
Yeah, so if you look at where USDA comes out for 2019 meat production, the thing I will start to notice is that we're getting that revision downward already in 2019 meat supplies. Not a lot of revision, down 190 million pounds this month relative to a month ago. Suggesting maybe a little more price strength might unfold in these livestock markets for 2019 out of the USDA data that we saw this week. If you look at the crop side of the equation, we will see both corn and soybean yields have been adjusted downward. Still ample supplies of corn and soybeans out there, I think, to keep feed costs under control. And we're really going to start to get focused on what's happening in South America as we think about where those prices go here over the next several weeks.
And as we look at lower potential for corn and soybean prices, obviously helps us offset declining cash prices and cattle and hog prices.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank goodness from a livestock perspective anyway, we have those lower feed costs. The last thing we need is dry weather to push feed costs up on top of what are already some lower livestock prices that we see today. I think that's provided some help in terms of the bottom line. It hasn't offset all the decline in output prices, but certainly been a boost to many producers.
Scott, monthly trade data came out this week, another big month, and it looks like beef is reigning supreme again in the export category.
That's right. This week we got the monthly export data out of USDA, and beef exports were up again in September. If you look at the volume of beef exports, up 6.2% relative to a year ago at this time. And then in value terms, this is where I think it's exciting when you see what's happening in the beef trade side, up nearly 12% in terms of value basis. It's been just a really good year for the beef side of the equation. Pork as well. You look at pork in September in terms of a volume basis. Pork exports were higher, up 2.6% versus a year ago. The problem on the pork side is when you look at it on a value basis, we were actually 3.5% lower. It just reminds us that tariffs matter, and those tariffs have certainly hurt on a value basis, despite we are still up on a volume basis.
And it's not hurting us just on high quality products that are exported or mid-range. It's also hurting us on some of those types of meats that we need to find other markets for.
Yeah, we talk an awful lot about the pork variety meat side of the equation, and China's certainly been the dominant consumer of pork variety meats in the world. And all of a sudden, when you talk about being shut off or shut out of that market, essentially for pork variety meats, it's hard to find other homes for those variety meats. The data that we have for September shows that on a value basis, pork variety meats out of the United States are down 34%. So just to emphasize tariffs matter, it's certainly been a market that's been tough for us in 2018.
When we take a look at the third quarter, talk to me a little bit about how some of the other numbers and some of the other figures that we're looking at for those numbers.
Yeah, so I think it is important to kind of look back at the third quarter of 18. I think in many cases we saw prices that maybe were higher than we anticipated they would be. And I think it's instructive when you start to look at the data to see what's been going on. And, first I'll start with, so beef production was up 84 million pounds in the third quarter of 18 relative to a year ago. Pork up 75 million pounds, while it's really chicken that was the big increase in the third quarter, up 378 million pounds. You add all that together, we were up about 537 million pounds of those three meats in terms of production in the third quarter. When you compare that to the net exports out of the United States of those same three meats, we were up about 320 million pounds. So in net, that meant domestic markets had to deal with an additional 220 million pounds. That may seem like a lot of additional meat to look at, but when you look at the first quarter of 2018, where we had to worry about another 440 million pounds on domestic markets, or the second quarter where we had to deal with another 475 million pounds on domestic markets, it goes to show you that production in the third quarter, the growth slowed, and we got some pretty strong export data as well that helped reduce the amount of additional supplies on domestic markets, and I think gave us a little bit of lift in prices. You'd have to go back to early 2017 before you would find a similar situation. We've just seen over really the 2015 to third quarter of 2018 period, production's been up every quarter over that period of time, and it's grown about 3 times the rate of what exports have grown over that period of time. So pretty tough in terms of additional domestic supplies on the marketplace.
Now we just need to get the value boosting in a couple of those big importers of products.
So we need to keep growing that domestic economy and also find value in those export markets if we want to talk about higher livestock prices in 2019.
Scott, good to see you this week as we take a look next week. Another quiet week for reports. What numbers are we watching next week?
Yes, we will get retail prices out next week from USDA, but it's otherwise a fairly quiet week in terms of livestock market reports.
I think next week we should talk a little bit about the meeting with President Trump and President Xi ahead of the G20 summit in Argentina, and talk a little bit about how that might have some implications into the markets a little bit, and even some trade as well.
I think that'll be a great topic, and certainly going to be important for these markets as we move forward.
Scott, good to see you. We will chat with you again next Friday.
That sounds great, Megan.
So our weekly livestock market update delivered to your email box every Saturday morning. Visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. You can click subscribe. You can also submit questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.